Hello everyone. The topic of our today's class is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or the HTTP. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, is used to define how the client-server programs can be written to retrieve web pages from the web. Let's see how the HTTP actually functions. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol client sends a request, then an HTTP server returns a response. The HTTP server uses the port number 80 and the HTTP client uses a temporary port number while undergoing transaction. And we must also note that the Hypertext Transfer Protocol uses the services of TCP, that is the Transmission Control Protocol, which is a connection-oriented and a reliable protocol. So this means that before any transaction between the client and the server can take place, a connection needs to be established between them. Which means before any transaction takes place, a connection needs to be established first between the client and the server. And after the transaction, the connection also needs to be terminated. And because the TCP is a reliable connection, the client and server do not need to worry about errors in messages exchange or loss of any message. We have two types of connection under Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The first one is the non-persistent connection, and the second one is the persistent type of connection. The HTTP concept embedded in web page documents may require several requests and responses. And if the web pages or objects to be retrieved are located in different servers, then we do not have any other choice than to create a new Transmission Control Protocol connection for retrieving each object. However, if the objects are located on the same server, then that means we have two choices. The first is either to retrieve each object using a new TCP connection, or the second option being to make a TCP connection and retrieve all the objects altogether. So this first method is referred to as the non-persistent type connection, and the second one is the persistent connection. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol prior to the version 1.1 had specified the non-persistent type connection, while the persistent type connection are now the default version, but however it can be changed by the user. First, let's come to the non-persistent type connection. In a non-persistent connection, one TCP connection is made for each response or request. The steps in this strategy, that is, the steps that's involved in non-persistent connection, are: the first step will be the client opens a TCP connection and then sends a request. And the second step, the server sends the response and closes the connection. And next, the client reads the data until it encounters an end file marker. It then closes the connection. in this type of non-persistent connection, if a file links to n different pictures in different files, all located on the same server, then the connection must be open and close n number of times plus 1 time. This means that if a file contains links to, let's say for example, 7 different objects, that means the connection must be open and close for 7 plus 1 times, that is 8 times. For this purpose, the non-persistent strategy, it imposes high overhead on the server because the server always needs n plus 1 different buffers each time a connection is open. This is an example of a non-persistent type connection. Here we can see that the client needs to access a file that contains one link to one image. The text file and image are located on the same server. So here we need 2 connections, and as we have seen earlier, for each connection, the TCP requires at least 3 handshake messages to establish the connection. But the request can be sent with the 3rd one. And after the connection is established, the object can be transferred. And after receiving the object, again another 3 handshake messages are needed to terminate the connection. This means that the client and server are involved in 2 connection establishments and 2 connection terminations. So if the transaction involves retrieving of say 10 or 20 objects, then the round trip times spent for these handshakes add up to a big overhead. This means that for each connection, the client and server need to locate extra resources such as buffers and variables. That's why this is another burden on both sides, and especially on the server side. Coming to the persistent type connection. In a persistent connection, the server leaves the connection open for more requests after sending a response. The server can close the connection at the request of a client or if a timeout has been reached. So what happens is that the sender usually sends the length of the data with each response. But there are some occasions when the sender does not know the length of the data. When such is the case, then a document is created dynamically or actively. And in these cases, the server informs the client that the length is not known and closes the connection after sending the data to the client, so the client knows that the end of the data has been reached. That's why in this type of persistent connection, time and resources are saved compared to the non-persistent one. And also, only a set of buffers and variables are needed to be set for the connection at each site. And the round-trip time for connection establishment and connection termination is also saved. This is the example of a persistent type connection. Here in this persistent connection, we can see that only one connection establishment and connection termination is used, but the request for the image is sent separately. So comparing these two figures, the persistent and the non-persistent connection, we can see the difference. Here at least 3 handshake messages are exchanged from each side, but here just one transaction.